My son said I was too poor to meet his rich in-laws. So they invited me to dinner without telling him. By the end of the night, a shocking family secret was revealed. The last time my son looked me in the eyes with pride, he was 12 years old. I still remember the smile on his face when I handed him his first second-hand bicycle. The paint was scratched, one pedal was slightly bent, and the seat had been stitched together with black thread. To anyone else, it looked like junk. To him, it looked like freedom. He hugged me so tightly that afternoon that I almost cried. "You're the best dad in the world," he whispered. Back then, I believed love was enough. I had no idea that years later, money would erase those words from his memory. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 64 years old, a retired carpenter, and I spent almost 40 years building homes for other families while trying to keep my own together. My wife, Emily, passed away from cancer 12 years ago. Before she died, she held my hand in the hospital and said something I never forgot. "No matter what happens, never let Ethan forget where he came from." I promised her I wouldn't. I kept my promise. Unfortunately, Ethan didn't. After Emily died, life became harder than I ever imagined. Hospital bills had swallowed nearly everything we owned. I sold my truck. Then I sold my tools. Eventually, I sold the little house where Ethan had grown up. The only thing I refused to sell was Emily's wedding ring. It stayed safely inside a small wooden box that I had carved myself decades earlier. Money disappeared. Memories didn't. I rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The wallpaper peeled from the walls. The kitchen sink leaked every winter. The heater made strange noises at night. But it was clean. It was peaceful. And it was home. Ethan graduated from college with honors. I worked construction jobs during the day and cleaned office buildings at night just to pay his tuition. I never told him how many meals I skipped. Parents aren't supposed to keep score. Seeing him succeed was enough. After graduation, Ethan landed a job at a prestigious investment firm. Within a few years, he was making more money in 1 month than I had made in an entire year. I was proud, at first. Then little things began changing. His phone calls became shorter. His visits became rarer. Birthday dinners turned into text messages. Christmas gifts arrived through delivery companies instead of his own hands. Every conversation somehow ended with, "I'm busy, Dad." I believed him, until I met Olivia. Olivia was beautiful, intelligent, and came from one of the wealthiest families in the state. Her parents owned luxury hotels, commercial buildings, and private resorts. Their last name carried influence. People treated them differently. I noticed Ethan started dressing differently, speaking differently, even laughing differently. One evening he invited me to coffee. "I have great news," he said. "I'm proposing to Olivia." I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt. "Your mother would be so proud." He nodded, but he looked nervous. "There is one thing." "What is it?" He stared into his coffee. "Her parents are very traditional. So, they're particular." I laughed. "About what?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he quietly said, "They care about appearances." I still didn't understand. So, he looked up. "Dad, maybe it would be better if you didn't come to the engagement dinner." For a moment, I thought I had heard him wrong. "What?" He sighed. "I'll introduce you later." "Later? The first impression is important." "I am your father." "I know. So why can't I come?" He rubbed his forehead. "I don't want things to be awkward." I felt my stomach tighten. "Awkward? You live in that apartment." I remained silent. "You don't really dress." Still silent. "They're wealthy. So, I don't want them judging us." Us. Not me. Us. As if I were some embarrassing stain on the life he'd built. I asked quietly, "Are you ashamed of me?" He looked away. "I just don't want complications." That answer hurt more than any insult. I stood. "I spent 30 years making sure you never felt ashamed of being poor." He said nothing. I guess I failed. I walked away before he could stop me. That night I sat alone at my kitchen table staring at Emily's wedding ring. "If only you were here," I whispered. A week later Ethan called. "I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings." "If, Dad." "No, Ethan, I just need you to understand." "I understand perfectly." There was a long silence. Then he changed the subject. "The wedding is next spring. I hope you're happy." "I am. I truly hope so." After hanging up, I cried for the first time since Emily's funeral. Not because my son had become rich. Because somewhere along the way, he had become poor in all the ways that mattered. 2 months passed. I heard almost nothing. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, someone knocked on my apartment door. I opened it. Standing outside was a well-dressed elderly woman holding a small umbrella. Behind her stood a distinguished gray-haired gentleman. Mr. Daniel Carter. Yes, she smiled warmly. I'm Margaret Holloway. The name sounded familiar. Then it hit me. Olivia's mother. My heart skipped. Had Ethan finally decided to introduce us? I'm sorry to come without warning, she said. May we come inside? I hesitated. My apartment was tiny. Simple furniture. Old carpet. Nothing impressive. She noticed my discomfort. Please don't worry, she said kindly. We came to meet you, not your furniture. Those words immediately felt different from what Ethan had said weeks earlier. I stepped aside. Please. They entered. Margaret admired the small wooden bookshelf. Her husband noticed the hand-carved coffee table. You made this yourself? He asked. I did. It's beautiful. No fake politeness. He genuinely meant it. We talked for almost an hour. Not once did they ask about my income. Not once did they mention wealth. Instead, they asked about Emily, about Ethan's childhood, about my carpentry. Margaret laughed at my old stories. Her husband, Richard, asked thoughtful questions. Finally Margaret looked serious. We owe you an apology. I frowned. For what? Our son-in-law told us you couldn't attend because you were traveling. I froze. Traveling? Yes. He said you had an extended vacation planned. My chest tightened. Ethan had lied, not only to me, but to them. Margaret slowly reached across the table. We suspected something wasn't right. Richard nodded. Then Olivia accidentally mentioned she had never met you. Silence filled the room. Margaret smiled gently. So, we'd like to fix that. She handed me an elegant cream-colored envelope. Inside was an invitation. Dinner. Saturday evening. Holloway Estate. No Ethan. No Olivia. Just them. Richard smiled. We'd like to know the man who raised the young man our daughter loves. I stared at the invitation. I don't think Ethan would like this. Margaret exchanged a glance with her husband. That's exactly why we didn't tell him. I looked up in surprise. She smiled. Sometimes the truth needs its own invitation. I had no idea that accepting that dinner invitation would change every one of our lives forever. Because before the night ended, a secret buried for over 35 years would finally come to light. And my son would discover that the man he was ashamed to call his father had sacrificed far more than anyone had ever imagined. Saturday evening arrived with a steady rain that made the streets shine beneath the lights. I almost turned my car around twice on the way to the Holloway estate. My old suit had been carefully pressed, but it was more than 15 years old. My shoes were polished until they reflected the porch lights, yet they still showed the cracks of time. A butler welcomed me with genuine courtesy and led me into a grand dining room. Everything was elegant, but what surprised me most was not the luxury, it was the warmth. Margaret greeted me with a smile. You came. I'm so glad. Richard shook my hand firmly. A craftsman always keeps his word. We spent nearly an hour talking before dinner. They asked about my years as a carpenter, the homes I had built, and Emily's passion for helping neighbors. Not once did they ask about my bank account. Then the front door opened. Footsteps echoed through the hallway. Ethan. He stopped the moment he saw me. Dad. His face turned pale. He looked at Margaret. You invited him. Margaret calmly replied, of course we did. We wanted to meet the man who raised you. Ethan forced a nervous laugh. There must have been some misunderstanding. Richard's expression hardened. No misunderstanding, only questions. The room fell silent. Olivia entered a moment later. She looked from Ethan to me and immediately sensed the tension. What's going on? Margaret answered softly. We discovered your father-in-law had never met Daniel. Olivia stared at Ethan. You told me your father preferred to stay away from formal gatherings. Ethan couldn't meet anyone's eyes. I simplified things. No, I said quietly. You lied. Those words hung heavily in the room. Dinner was served, but hardly anyone touched the food. Richard finally broke the silence. Daniel, would you tell us about Ethan as a child? I smiled despite everything. He was curious. He loved taking apart radios and toys just to see how they worked. Every Christmas he wanted books instead of expensive gifts. Olivia listened with tears beginning to form. I've never heard these stories. Ethan remained silent. Then Margaret noticed the old watch on my wrist. That's beautiful. I smiled. It stopped working years ago. Why keep wearing it? Because Ethan gave it to me with his first paycheck. It was the proudest day of my life. Ethan slowly looked up. He remembered. The expensive watches he owned today suddenly seemed meaningless beside that old, broken one. Richard leaned back. I've built companies my entire life, he said. Do you know what I've learned? No one answered. A person's greatest achievement isn't the money they earn. It's the character they leave in their children. The words struck Ethan harder than any accusation. Just then, Margaret excused herself and returned carrying a small wooden box. Daniel, she asked gently, is this yours? I froze. Emily's wooden keepsake box. I thought I'd lost it years ago. It was left in a storage unit we purchased decades ago. We never knew who it belonged to until recently. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was Emily's wedding ring. And beneath it, a folded letter in her handwriting. A letter I had never seen. Everyone watched in silence as I carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. My heart raced. Emily had written it only weeks before she died. The first line stole my breath. If you're reading this, then the truth has finally found its way home. None of us yet realized that the words on the next page would reveal a secret connecting my family to the Holloways in a way none of us could have imagined. My hands trembled as I unfolded Emily's letter. The room became so quiet that even the ticking of the old grandfather clock sounded loud. I cleared my throat and began reading. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell you everything in person. I kept this secret because I was afraid it would change the way you looked at our family. I stopped for a moment. Everyone watched silently. I continued. 35 years ago, before Ethan was born, I worked as a nurse at St. Anne's Hospital. One winter night, a terrible fire broke out in the maternity wing. There was panic everywhere. Mothers were crying. Babies had to be evacuated in minutes. Richard slowly leaned forward. His face had turned pale. The letter continued. One newborn stopped breathing because of the smoke. The doctors believed he wouldn't survive. Daniel rushed into the burning building without thinking about his own safety. He carried that baby outside and saved his life. Richard suddenly stood up. His chair slid across the floor. No. Margaret looked at him in confusion. What is it? Richard whispered, almost unable to breathe. The date. He hurried toward a bookshelf, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old newspaper clipping that had been framed decades earlier. The headline read, Local Carpenter Saves Newborn During Hospital Fire. The newspaper photo was faded, but the young carpenter holding a firefighter's blanket was unmistakably me. Richard looked at me with tears in his eyes. You, his voice cracked, you were the man who saved our son. The room froze. Olivia covered her mouth. What? Richard nodded slowly. Our first child nearly died in that fire. We searched for the man who rescued him, but no one could ever tell us his name. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. For 35 years, we prayed that someday we could thank him. I couldn't find the words. I had never known whose child I had carried out of that hospital. Emily's letter explained why. The hospital kept the family's identity private. Daniel never wanted recognition. He simply said, anyone would have done the same. Richard shook his head. No, not everyone. He walked around the table and stopped in front of me. Then, to everyone's surprise, one of the richest businessmen in the state extended both hands and said quietly, I've waited 35 years to say this. Thank you, for giving my family a future. Tears rolled down Margaret's cheeks. She embraced me like an old friend. Olivia looked toward Ethan. He stood motionless. The shame on his face was impossible to hide. He had spent months trying to hide the father who had once risked his life for strangers. Richard finally turned toward him. Ethan, do you understand what you've done? Ethan lowered his head. I do now. No, Richard replied gently. I don't think you do. You were embarrassed by a man whose courage money could never buy. The words cut deeper than any anger could have. For the first time that evening, Ethan looked directly at me. His eyes were red. Dad, I'm sorry. I remained silent. He took one slow step forward. I spent so much time trying to impress people that I forgot the person who impressed me most when I was growing up. His voice broke. I forgot the man who taught me honesty, hard work, and kindness. The room remained quiet. No one interrupted him. I can't change what I said. I can't erase how badly I hurt you. But if you'll ever give me another chance, I'd like to earn back the right to call myself your son. I looked at the old wedding ring resting inside Emily's wooden box. She had always believed that people deserved the opportunity to become better. I closed the box gently. Then I stood. Slowly, I wrapped my arms around Ethan. He broke down in tears like a little boy. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about success, status, or appearances. He was simply a son holding his father. Richard smiled quietly. Margaret wiped away her tears. Olivia whispered, I think this is what real wealth looks like. But none of us yet knew that one final surprise awaited before the night was over, a decision that would change the future of both families forever. The room remained silent after Ethan embraced me. For a long moment, no one spoke. The years of distance between us seemed to fade, replaced by memories of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the little boy who once believed his father could fix anything. Richard finally broke the silence. "There's one more thing I'd like to do tonight." He walked to a nearby cabinet and removed a leather folder. "I had planned to announce this at our family gathering next month," he said. "But after everything we've learned tonight, it feels right to do it now." He placed the folder on the table. "Our family foundation has funded schools, hospitals, and shelters for years. Lately we've wanted to create a vocational training center where young people can learn carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, and other skilled trades free of charge." He looked directly at me. "We want you to lead it." I stared at him in disbelief. "Me?" Richard smiled. "Not because you saved my son's life. And not because you're Ethan's father." He paused. "Because every person in this room can see that you've spent your entire life building more than houses. You've built people." I was speechless. "I don't have a business degree," I finally said. Richard laughed. "I already have enough people with business degrees. What I need is someone with character." Margaret nodded. "And we'd like the center to carry Emily's name." At the mention of my late wife, tears filled my eyes again. "The Emily Carter Skills Academy," she said softly. "So every student who walks through those doors knows the story of a woman whose kindness inspired everyone around her." I looked toward the ceiling for a brief moment. "If you're watching, Emily," I whispered, "this belongs to you." Olivia reached across the table and squeezed Ethan's hand. "I think your mother would be proud." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Over the next few weeks, news of the hospital rescue quietly spread through the community. A local newspaper published the story after Richard shared the decades-old clipping. People praised me for saving a life. But what mattered most wasn't the headlines. It was the phone call I received every Sunday afternoon. "Dad," Ethan would say, "want to have lunch?" Sometimes we worked together in my small workshop. Sometimes we visited Emily's grave. Sometimes we said very little at all. We were learning something we'd both forgotten. Healing doesn't happen in a single conversation. It happens one choice at a time. Months later, the Emily Carter Skills Academy opened its doors. The first class included teenagers who couldn't afford college, single parents looking for a fresh start, and veterans beginning new careers. I watched them measure wood, learn new skills, and gain confidence. One afternoon a young student asked me, "Mr. Carter, what's the secret to building something that lasts?" I smiled. "The same secret that builds a family." He waited for my answer. "Use strong foundations, be patient, and never judge something by how it looks before you learn what's inside." He nodded thoughtfully. Across the workshop, Ethan was helping another student cut a piece of oak. He looked happier than I had seen him in years. Not because of his salary. Not because of his title. But because he had rediscovered the values he'd almost lost. A year later, our entire family gathered for dinner again. This time there were no lies. No embarrassment. No hidden invitations. Just laughter filling the room. Before we ate, Richard stood and raised his glass. "To Daniel." I shook my head. "No, to everyone who remembers that wealth isn't measured by the size of a house, the balance in a bank account, or the brand on a suit." I looked around the table. My greatest treasure has always been the people I love. Everyone raised their glasses, and for the first time in many years, I felt Emily's promise had finally come true. Ethan had remembered where he came from. That night, as we left the house together, my son quietly slipped his arm around my shoulder. "I'm proud to be your son, Dad." I smiled. "I've always been proud to be your father." Sometimes life gives us riches. Sometimes it takes them away. But kindness, integrity, sacrifice, and love are treasures that no fortune can buy, and no hardship can ever take away. 6 months passed. The Emily Carter Skills Academy had become more than a training center. It had become a second home for people who believed they had run out of chances. Every Monday morning, I unlocked the workshop before sunrise. The smell of fresh cut wood always reminded me of the first house Emily and I had built together. She used to say, "A strong home isn't built with expensive materials. It's built with honest hands." Those words were now hanging on a wooden plaque above the entrance. One afternoon, Ethan walked into the workshop wearing jeans and work boots instead of an expensive suit. The students looked surprised. "Morning, everyone," he said with a smile. "Today I'm here to learn." I handed him a plane and pointed toward a rough oak board. If you're going to teach these kids about business, I said, you should first learn how hard people work before they earn their first paycheck. He smiled. Yes, sir. For the next 3 hours, father and son worked side by side. His hands became covered in sawdust. His shirt was soaked with sweat. When the board was finally smooth, Ethan looked at it proudly. I've closed million-dollar deals, he admitted, but this feels different. It should, I replied. You earned this with your own hands. Later that week, Olivia arrived carrying a small photo album. I found these while cleaning, she said. Inside were photographs from Ethan's childhood. There was one picture of him sitting on my shoulders during a county fair. Another showed Emily teaching him how to bake cookies. The final picture stopped all of us. It showed our tiny first house. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't expensive, but everyone in the picture was smiling. Olivia quietly whispered, I understand now. Understand what? Ethan asked. You spent years trying to build a life that looked successful. She pointed at the photograph. But this was already success. Ethan lowered his head. You've always seen things more clearly than I have. A month later, the academy held its first graduation ceremony. Families filled the auditorium. Some students had arrived with nothing. Now they were leaving with new careers, confidence, and hope. Richard stepped onto the stage. Tonight, he announced, we're honoring the man who inspired this academy. Before I could react, my name echoed through the room. People stood. Then they applauded. I felt embarrassed. I don't deserve this, I whispered. Margaret smiled. Perhaps. But you've earned it. Instead of accepting a trophy, I walked to the microphone. I want to tell you something. The room became quiet. I spent years believing my greatest achievement was raising my son. I looked toward Ethan. Then I thought I'd failed. He shook his head, tears already forming. But life reminded me that people can lose their way and still find their way home. I turned toward the graduates. Never measure your worth by the size of someone's bank account. Measure it by how many lives become better because you were in them. The audience rose to its feet once again. After the ceremony, Ethan handed me a small wrapped box. I know nothing can repay everything you've done. I slowly opened it. Inside was the old wristwatch I had worn for years. Completely restored. It ticked perfectly. I tracked down the best watchmaker in the country, Ethan said. I wanted to give you back the time I can't replace. I couldn't speak. Instead, I hugged him. This time, neither of us cried from sadness. We cried because forgiveness had done what money never could. It had given us our family back. As we walked outside, the evening sky glowed with the colors of sunset. I looked at Emily's wedding ring on the chain around my neck and smiled. You were right, I whispered. True wealth has never been about money. It's about the people who stand beside you when everything else is gone. And with my son walking beside me once again, not ahead of me, not behind me, but beside me, I knew our family's greatest chapter wasn't the one we'd left behind. It was the one we had finally begun. 2 years passed. The Emily Carter Skills Academy had grown beyond anything we had imagined. Students came from neighboring towns, each carrying a story of hardship and hope. Some had lost jobs, others had never been given a chance, but every one of them walked through our doors believing life could begin again. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan knocked on my workshop door before sunrise. Dad, he said with a grin, I need your help. I laughed. After all these years, you finally admit you still need your old man. He smiled. I always did. I was just too proud to say it. We drove to an empty piece of land just outside town. What do you think? He asked. I looked around. About what? He handed me a set of blueprints. Across the top were the words, the Emily and Daniel Carter Community Center. I stared at the plans in disbelief. It will have classrooms, a library, a food pantry, and a workshop, Ethan explained. Everything you and Mom believed every family deserves. My eyes filled with tears. You planned all of this? He nodded. I spent years chasing success for myself. Now I want to spend the rest of my life creating opportunities for others. For the first time in many years, I saw the little boy who had once proudly ridden home on that old bicycle. Not because he had become young again, but because he had become humble again. Months later, construction was complete. On opening day, hundreds of families gathered outside. Before cutting the ribbon, Ethan stepped to the microphone. I used to think wealth meant having more than everyone else, he said. My father taught me that real wealth means leaving the world better than you found it. He turned toward me. Everything good I know began with the man I was once ashamed to introduce. The crowd fell silent. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I never forget that again. People applauded as he handed me the scissors. No, I said, placing them back in his hand. We'll do it together. Father and son cut the ribbon side by side. As the doors opened, children rushed inside laughing, parents smiled with relief, and volunteers welcomed every family without asking where they came from or how much money they had. That evening, Ethan and I sat on a wooden bench outside the center. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the hills. You know, he said quietly, I used to think I was building a legacy. I smiled. And now I know a legacy isn't measured by what you leave behind. It's measured by the lives you live while you're still here. I looked up at the sky and whispered. We kept our promise, Emily. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, and for a moment, it felt as though she was smiling with us. Our family had started with very little. We had nearly lost everything that mattered, but in the end, we discovered the one treasure that could never be bought, sold, or inherited. A family united by love, forgiveness, and the courage to choose each other again. 3 years after the community center opened, life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every Saturday morning, I unlocked the workshop before anyone else arrived. The smell of fresh wood still reminded me that no matter how many years passed, honest work never went out of style. As I arranged the tools on the workbench, a black sedan slowly pulled into the parking lot. A woman stepped out, followed by a young man in his early 20s. She looked nervous. Mr. Carter, she asked. Yes, my name is Sarah Collins. I smiled politely. How can I help you? She looked around the workshop before speaking. My son, Noah, needs a second chance. The young man kept his eyes on the floor. I made some bad decisions, he admitted quietly. No one will hire me. I invited them inside. For nearly an hour, I listened without interrupting. When they finished, I simply asked Noah one question. Are you looking for a job, or are you looking for a new life? He looked surprised. I don't know. I nodded. That's an honest answer. The following Monday, Noah became the newest apprentice at the academy. He struggled at first. He arrived late. He made mistakes. More than once, he thought about quitting. But Ethan stopped him every time. I know what it's like to lose your way, he told him. The important part is deciding where you're going next. Months passed. The quiet, uncertain young man slowly became one of the hardest workers in the workshop. One afternoon, I noticed him carefully helping another student who couldn't figure out a complicated cabinet joint. He stayed nearly 2 hours after everyone else had left. As I watched from across the room, I smiled. That was the moment I knew he had changed. Not because he had become skilled, but because he had begun thinking about someone else's future instead of only his own. A few weeks later, Richard called an emergency board meeting. I've decided to retire, he announced. The room fell silent. Margaret reached for his hand. It's time. Richard looked toward Ethan. I've spent decades building businesses. Then he turned toward me. But Daniel reminded me that businesses matter only when they serve people. He handed Ethan a single envelope. Inside was a letter naming Ethan the next president of the family foundation. Ethan looked stunned. I don't know if I'm ready. Richard smiled. I wasn't asking if you were ready. I was asking if you remembered the lesson your father taught you. Ethan looked across the table at me. I do. Richard nodded. Then you'll do just fine. That evening, our entire family gathered for dinner. No expensive speeches, no formal celebration, just homemade food, laughter, and stories. Halfway through the meal, my granddaughter Emma climbed onto my lap. Grandpa, she asked, why does everyone call you the richest man they know? We don't even have the biggest house. The table became quiet. I smiled and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. Because real riches aren't counted in dollars. She frowned. Then how do you count them? I looked around the table. At my son, at Olivia, at Richard and Margaret, at the students whose lives had become part of our family. Then I answered softly, you count them by the number of people who are happier because you were here. Emma smiled. I want to be rich like that. I kissed her forehead. You already are. Outside, the evening sun disappeared behind the hills. Inside, our family continued laughing together. And in that moment, I realized something I had searched my whole life to understand. The greatest inheritance a parent can leave isn't money, property, or success. It's a heart that remembers where it came from. 5 years later, the old Carter family house no longer existed. It had been sold years before to pay hospital bills, and I had accepted that some chapters of life could never be reopened. Or so I thought. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan stopped by my workshop carrying a small envelope. "Dad," he said with a grin, "I need you to come with me." "Where are we going?" "It's a surprise." 20 minutes later, we pulled into a quiet neighborhood. The moment I stepped out of the car, my heart skipped. I recognized the street immediately. This can't be. At the end of the road stood the little white house where Emily and I had raised Ethan. The porch had been repaired. The garden was blooming again. Even the old oak tree in the front yard was still standing. I looked at Ethan in disbelief. "You," he smiled. "I spent months searching for it." "You bought it," he nodded. "Not as an investment." He handed me the envelope. Inside was the deed. Across the top, my name was printed as the owner. I looked at him, speechless. "I can't accept this." "Yes, you can. You taught me that a home isn't measured by its price." He smiled through tears. "So I wanted to bring yours back." For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I wrapped my arms around him. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Dad. You've already given me everything." That evening, the entire family gathered inside the old house. Margaret placed fresh flowers beneath Emily's framed photograph. Richard quietly walked through the workshop in the garage, running his hand across the old wooden bench. "It feels alive again," he whispered. Olivia laughed as Emma raced through the hallway. Grandpa, come see my room." I followed her upstairs. She had placed one of Emily's quilts across the bed. "I wanted Grandma to be part of my room," she said. My eyes filled with tears. "I think she'd love it." As night fell, everyone gathered on the back porch. Ethan stood and gently tapped his glass. "I have one last announcement." He looked at me. "When I was younger, I believed success meant becoming someone important." He paused. "But the greatest achievement of my life was becoming my father's son again." Silence filled the porch. "I've asked the board to create a permanent scholarship." He unfolded a small plaque. "The Daniel and Emily Carter Legacy Scholarship. For students who show kindness, perseverance, and integrity, regardless of their financial circumstances." The family applauded. I shook my head with a smile. "Your mother would have liked that." "I know," Ethan replied. "Everything good that happens here started with the lessons you both gave me." Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the porch swing. The stars filled the sky. A gentle breeze moved through the oak tree Emily had planted decades ago. I closed my eyes and smiled. Our family had known loss. We had known pride, regret, forgiveness, and second chances. But in the end, we discovered something far more valuable than wealth. Money can build a mansion. Character builds a home. Money can impress strangers. Love can heal a family. And as I listened to the laughter of my grandchildren echoing from inside the house, I realized that the greatest gift wasn't getting my old home back. It was knowing that my family had finally found its way back to one another. 10 years passed. The Emily and Daniel Carter Community Center had become a landmark in the town. Thousands of young people had learned trades, found jobs, and rebuilt their lives. By then, my hair had turned completely white. My hands were slower than they used to be, but I still opened the workshop every Monday morning. One afternoon, Emma, now a confident young woman preparing for college, walked into my office carrying a small notebook. "Grandpa," she asked, "will you help me with something?" "Of course. I've been asked to give a graduation speech." She hesitated. "I want people to remember it." I smiled. "Then don't talk about success." She looked puzzled. "What should I talk about?" "Talk about gratitude." She sat beside me as I pulled an old wooden box from the shelf. Inside were 3 things: Emily's wedding ring, my old restored wristwatch, the first toy car Ethan had carved as a little boy. Emma smiled. "You kept all of these." "They remind me that the smallest things often carry the biggest memories." That evening, Emma wrote her speech while I shared stories she had never heard before. Stories about sacrifice, about forgiveness, about second chances. A week later, the graduation hall was filled with families. Emma stepped onto the stage. She took a deep breath before speaking. "My grandfather once told me that people spend their lives trying to become rich." She paused. "But the richest people I've ever known weren't the ones with the biggest houses. They were the ones whose kindness kept making other people's lives better." Many parents quietly wiped away tears. Emma continued, "My great-grandmother believed that every person deserves another chance. My grandfather proved that forgiveness is stronger than pride." And my father taught me that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be." The audience rose in applause before she had even finished. I looked at Ethan. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. We were both thinking about how far our family had come. That night, after the celebration, Emma handed me a sealed envelope. "Don't open it until tomorrow." The next morning, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and carefully unfolded the letter. It read, "Dear Grandpa, everything our family has today exists because one man refused to let hardship make him bitter. You taught us that honesty is worth more than wealth, that forgiveness is stronger than anger, and that a family's greatest inheritance is its values. Someday, when I'm old enough to have children of my own, I'll tell them your story, not because you were perfect, but because you never stopped choosing love over pride. Thank you for showing us what true wealth really means. Love, Emma." By the time I reached the last line, my vision had blurred with tears. I folded the letter and placed it inside Emily's wooden box. It belonged there, because our family's greatest treasure had never been money. It had always been the lessons we passed from one generation to the next. As the morning sun rose over the workshop, I smiled quietly. The story that began with a son ashamed of his father had become the story of a family that would never forget where it came. 15 years later, the town had changed. New buildings stood where empty lots had once been. Small businesses had opened. Families who had once struggled were now thriving. Whenever people asked how it all began, someone would always point toward the Emily and Daniel Carter Community Center. It started with one man who believed everyone deserved a second chance. By then, I had retired from teaching. My hands no longer had the strength to shape heavy pieces of oak, but I still visited the workshop every Friday morning. The sound of saws and hammers had become the soundtrack of my life. One afternoon, Ethan walked into my home carrying a familiar wooden box. "Dad," he said quietly, "I think it's time." I looked at the box and smiled. Emily's keepsake box. Inside were the treasures that had carried our family's story through the years. Emily's wedding ring, my restored wristwatch, her handwritten letter, Emma's graduation letter, the old photograph of our first tiny house. Ethan placed the box on the table. "I've added one more thing." He handed me a folded document. "What is this?" "The community center will never belong to our family." I looked at him in surprise. "It now belongs to a public trust. So no one can ever sell it. So it will always serve families who need hope." I couldn't hide my pride. "Your mother would have loved this decision." He smiled. "I finally understand what she and you spent your whole lives trying to teach me." That evening, the entire family gathered at the old Carter house. Emma had become a teacher. Noah now managed the woodworking program. Olivia organized scholarships for students every year. Richard and Margaret, though much older, still attended every graduation ceremony. After dinner, Emma stood and raised her glass. "I have an announcement." Everyone looked toward her. "I'm expecting a baby." For a moment, the room was silent. Then it erupted with laughter, applause, and happy tears. Emma walked over to me and gently took my hand. "Grandpa, I hope my child grows up hearing your stories." I smiled. "Don't tell them stories about me." She looked confused. "Then whose stories should I tell?" "Tell them stories about kindness. About forgiveness. About choosing family over pride. If they learn those lessons, they'll know everything important about me." Months later, a baby boy was born. The family gathered once again. Emma carefully placed him in my arms. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine. For a moment, I was carried back through time, to the day I held Ethan as a newborn, promising Emily that I would always protect our family. Now another generation had begun. Ethan stood beside me with tears in his eyes. "You were right, Dad." "About what?" "The richest inheritance isn't money. It's values." I nodded. "And those are the only riches that grow every time you share them." As everyone gathered for one final family photograph beneath the old oak tree, I looked around at the people beside me. Years ago, I had feared losing my son forever. Instead, I had gained a stronger family than I ever imagined. The camera flashed. In that single photograph were 4 generations connected not by wealth, but by love, sacrifice, forgiveness, and hope. Looking at them, I realized my life's work had never been building houses. It had been building a family that would stand strong long after I was gone. And that, I knew with complete certainty, was the greatest inheritance anyone could ever leave behind.